For context, the Familia nation was formed as a Discord group chat. It was an unstable nation that saw many coups, revolutions, and civil wars. These are the tales of those wars. To anyone willing to listen, my name is William Petrov. As I speak to you, Vivance is destroying national monuments of the country, burning history books, and executing anyone suspected of being a socialist. I fear what little history remains of our once great country is on the verge of being extinct. I am here to document a decade of history from the 1910s to the 1920s. One decade that many philosophers say is the greatest period in our young world's entire history, and the perilous of times in our nation, Familia's history. I'm talking about the rise of the Axis forces, primarily Garderica, Vivas, and Yamato, along with its Axis power members in their war for global dominance. Never in human history has the world ever been disrupted by such a conflict. Countless lives in servitude, and even more slaughtered on a whim. Continents being occupied and entire countries being divided like mere footnotes. Nations devolve into warring factions. It's important that the Familian public know the truth, and only the truth. What led to the rise of Garderica from a fragile democracy to the bastion it is now today of servitude and authoritarianism. Heed my words, so that you may be wise and better combat the threats to our nation and world peace. If someone told me that a nation like Garderica, at the end of the 1910s, after the end of the Familian War and the First Continental War, where a battered, poor, and war-weary nation would become an ultra-militaristic, authoritarian superpower, I'd honestly say you'd had a little too much to drink. And why would I? After the war, Garderica was split into several independent nations. Its army demilitarized, its government democratic, but its people bitter. Its growth into the military complex it is now today honestly warrants its own bloody tape. As not one cause, as objectively as I see it, can be attributed to the rise of Garderica, and ultimately, the Axis. On one hand, the failure of Telsus is the first cause. The Telsus Union was the international military coalition which was formed during the First Continental War and named after the continent. After the war, though, Telsus was in shambles. The war was simply hell. I served as a mechanic during the war and helped manage a 1,000-kilometer-long trench system. I nearly lost my leg to infections, but Garderican soldiers suffered much, much more. Losing entire battalions of men due to infection from a single rat alone. The extensive trench network, combined with the poor resources to manage it, coupled with the fact that Garderica was not ready for a war of attrition, meant that the nation was essentially eating itself alive. The reason I'm telling you this is to prove the allegations I'm claiming, and prove that I was, rather am, who I claim to be. My first case study is Alair, the nation that held the capital of the Telsus Union. One morning after a corruption scandal from one of its key members, Oberberg, the government denounced what they call a clear disloyalty to its member states, and a deal with the devil for individual gain. Many other politicians in Alair declared the Telsus Union to be a weak, rotting carcass. Following the announcement of Alair, Oberberg declared its withdrawal of the Telsus Union, which it deemed to have become weak and corrupt. Branzi and other states seceded, following the departure of Oberberg, and other numerous states, dissatisfied by many common policies of the Union, also declared their withdrawal from the Union. With Branzi seceded, there was a border skirmish with Garda forces in the region, which escalated to two other neighboring countries bordering Garda. After Garda claimed both of them attacked their forces operating on the border, the countries were crushed in a matter of days. Their regions were all annexed into Garda after a democratic referendum, a majority of 91% for Branzi and 97 and 98 for the two other republics, voting for reunification with Garda. Many of the remaining members were shocked by the lack of cohesion within the Union, especially with the Lair's decision to withdraw from Telsus. All of its major members have left, and the power of the Union came close to none. Telsus failed at its objective: unite the continent. Being fully cut off from the rest of the Union and being heavily disadvantaged by the Telsus Union, while not benefiting from its trade, the Eastern Republics all seceded one by one from the Union, which they deemed useless. Sometime after, the same violent border skirmishes occurred, and many nations' lands were illegally annexed by one another. The second main reason for the rise of the Axis could be because of the destabilization of the region, especially Familia, and in the East. Whether it was a civil war in Ubal, chaos in Strigil, or the infamous Familian Civil War, the Axis used whatever opportunity was present to further their influence and destabilize the Telsus Union, which by this point had less than 10 nations under its banner, whereas the Axis were garnering more nations to their cause. In the south, Familia was in the middle of a full-blown civil war. Karl von Papen led the nationalist forces, but the pro-democratic forces were led by Melvin Tennyson, a progressive. However, as the months turned to years, the end of the war was nowhere in sight. As a result, Telsus intervened in the matter and ended the civil war, which at this point devolved into a bunch of feudal conflicts. The communists famously managed to take the capital of Familia, thanks to the tactical brilliance of Yuri Wolensky, the Familian People's Workers' Party proclaiming a socialist state. The progressives dealt a killing blow to the nationalist forces, encircling 50,000 of their best men in a single battle alone. However, most horrifically, the nationalists employed the caravan of death to try and win back the war in their favor. A well-trained, experienced, well-equipped, highly fascist paramilitary group formed by a despised Garda general known only as Huey, sometime in 1911, so that they can freely indulge in their depraved sense of justice across battlefields. 600,000 civilians were killed by them alone in mass rapes, slaughters, and slave labor. Yuri Wolensky was elected president of the new federation, who had numerous hindering political treaties imposed on it by the Telsus Union and numerous military sanctions. Any deviation would result in another invasion by another intervention force. Familia remained stagnant, but fairly peaceful. Her army limited to 100,000 troops and her economy barely enough to tend for her citizens. Violent separatist groups in Nymuria and the west were always a hassle for the army to deal with. However, the most crippling feature of the treaty imposed on Familia was the Grand Federation Treaty, allowing for numerous autonomous nations like Aesel, Vachen, and Nymuria, all following one central banner of the federal government, the Federation of Familia. However, rarely did they ever care about unification or anything other than themselves. A shameful treaty to some, a desperate measure for others. One thing was for certain: Familia was not ready for war. With Vivance and Garda having many common interests, both nations, which had already been seeking closer ties for a while, decided to officialize a military alliance. Their aim: recover both of their national sovereignty and challenge the capitalist world order for a better and more just order of things, where so-called sovereignty shines. After years of preparation and their recent victory against their historical rival family, Vivance and most of the former constituent nations within Vivance decided to reunify into a single, unitary country and abolish for good all democratic institutions left in Vivance. Their respective states committing wide purges against corruption and their so-called ideological decadence. However, it wasn't until another nation in the south, Yamato, annexed the Mariana Federation and waged wars on two continents, tensions were truly rising. The western continent, Carmania, and the eastern continent, Sevestia. Deeming that Mariana was a threat due to its weakness, meaning it could be exploited as a base against Yamato interests, the Empire of Greater Yamato decided to occupy the small federation and integrate it as part of their empire. All while Familia was still bickering with itself, Yamato and the Axis, wishing to achieve common goals and being both very admonished by the international community, both sides met in person to negotiate a military alliance and potential military coordination in case of war. By the end of the late 1910s, Yamato had joined the Axis alliance as well. To prevent the expansion of the Vivas-Garderica axis, the countries from the former center of Telsus formed a defensive military alliance known as the Defensive Pact for Central Telsus. However, by this point it was already too late. Now that we've settled on the affairs of old, it's time I direct my attention to how this cursed war started. And I'll be honest, I don't remember the exact details, but it was on any normal morning, and allegedly, forces of Garderica and Unclum had a battle on their border. Allegedly, Unclumian soldiers shot at Garderican soldiers, and as a result, Gardericans retaliated, causing a battle that lasted for a whole day. Tensions between both nations were at an all-time high, and Garderica severed all ties with the Central Telsus alliance. Garderica demanded economic and territorial compensations for the resulting clashes. It stated that it will, by any means, defend their interests and justice. The Central Telsus stated, however, that it was willing to jointly pay the economic compensations, but will never give any more land compensations. But Garderica crossed the border. Seeing that Unclum refused to provide the rightful land compensations, Garderican troops crossed into Unclum in order to forcefully take their claims. They also start a massive air raid on the capital of Unclum, as well as other major cities, leveling each of them in fire for multiple days. Finally, Unclum triggered Article 4 of the Central Telsus Alliance. Seeing the Garderican invasion, the Unclum Socialist Republic triggered Article 4 of the CTA. An attack on one is an attack on all. And the war had begun. In a matter of months, though, Telsus was crushed. In just 5 months, Garderica with Vivance invaded Familia and the rest of the Telsus alliance, as the nations were close to collapse. Numerous ministers and the president of Familia killed themselves in a suicide pact. The de facto leader of Familia at that point, Generalissimo Thomas Shelby, who was the head of defense for the nation, took it upon himself to abolish the Federation of Familia, resulting in 2 nations seceding. And although Familia was more united, Vivas used that opportunity to invade, along with Branzi, resulting in Familia being defeated by their eastern rival Vivas as the occupation forces waved the Axis flag over the capital city, Opidium. A new occupational government was announced, and Familia was carved apart by Vivance and the victors. One prominent fascist collaborator who was chosen to lead was Saul Goodman. Being one of the most trusted Vivician collaborators, Huey, the head of the Caravan of Death PMC group, a rolling band of mercenaries that were despised by all, were chosen as one of the most elite soldiers to help garrison Familia. Brave resistance groups rose up, such as the government in exile, led by Ion Werner, from abroad in the eastern continent Sevesta, and the other forces being led by Max von Baden. The Communists, the largest partisan force, were led by Thomas Shelby, the former Generalissimo of Familia, who is now turning 67. Established the Underground Railway, an elaborate series of tunnel systems created by Leon Medvedev, the right-hand man of Thomas Shelby, and used this to hide communists from persecution. With the Continental War raging on, the United States of Imuria, a democratic superpower on the eastern continent Sevesta, decided to now fully commit to the war effort. General mobilization of all men with past military experience has been declared. General mobilization will also spread to most men able to fight. Meanwhile, the whole economy has been mobilized to carry on the war, as all vital and non-vital industry was converted to weapon production. Many Democrats within Familia shouting, "The giant has awoken." Reports are still fuzzy, but as it appears the Allies are making steady but great progress in Sevestia. Ion Werner being the leader of the government in exile, making grand speeches at the parliament, and helping lead Imurian forces into victory. Allegedly, the tide of the war is shifting in Sevestia, but the fog of war is still heavy and reports aren't out yet. However, as of recording this, Familia has struck a killing blow to the occupational forces. After a year of the occupation, famine was rampant. Hundreds upon thousands left Familia yearly, and even more died as people went days if not weeks without basic necessities, like food, water, or even shelter, all while Wagner and the occupational government began to lose their grip on Familia. It was no secret that should Familia be lost to Imuria in an amphibious invasion, the Axis would be facing a war on the home front, and with the growing unrest among the populace by the ineffective means of the Axis to tend to their needs, the increasing support was garnering for resistance groups, and it would be difficult to hold back the growing forces of the United States of Imuria. However, an uprising took place on the dawn of January 15th, 1923, near a town in Familia called Ilino. Huey, the leader of the Caravan of Death paramilitary group, was killed by Leon Medvedev, and Saul eventually went into hiding, leaving one man in power, Karl von Papen. Papen, who was a former collaborator turned pro-democrat, worked closely with the communists and the government in exile and seek to free Familia from the Axis grip. To do this, however, Leon Medvedev, alongside Thomas Shelby, worked to overthrow the system from within, implanting spies at key positions where fascists would frequent, and getting a hold of their locations, whereabouts, and best time for assassination to all those loyal to the collaborators. Those who frequented brothels were found their throats slit in their sleep by communist conspirators. Members of Wagner were killed in hit-and-run tactics, and Huey, although was captured in the sting operation, eventually took his own life, and Saul Goodman fled. Seeing the instability in their puppet government, Vivants further escalated their involvement in Familia, placing a 400,000-strong garrison and mercilessly gassing cities believed to house rebels. Untold hundreds of thousands were killed in the bombing runs alone, even more from the gassing. With their plan in place and Papen in power, all resistance were quote-unquote defeated by Papen, when in reality they slinked back underground where all remaining resistance loyal to the fascists were killed by the communists in an effort to keep Papen in power. After Vivatian's bombing runs and escalation in Familia died down, the communists began exacting their revenge on the collaborators, specifically the Caravan of Death, for all their crimes in the Familian Civil War and the occupation. This event was known as the Red Feast. Papen organized a feast to all Wagner personnel and encouraged 40,000 of them to attend with their family members and friends. Little did they know this would be the last feast they'd ever have. Leon Medvedev led a special detachment of soldiers disguised as musicians. Cupbearers poured poison into wine of the unsuspecting Wagner personnel executing men, women, and children of the fascist collaborators and parading the body of Huey, the leader of Wagner, around all of the feast sites, flaying Wagner personnel alive, stabbing pregnant women. Nearly all members of Wagner were purged in a single night. However, not all members of Wagner were killed. Some high-ranking members were kept alive for later torture as Leon Medvedev made a speech to them, and all of Wagner. 40,000 members were killed that day, but so were 60,000 innocents. Many radicals and even civilians thanked the communists for doing what needed to be done, killing and purging them for what they had did so heavily to Familia during the Civil War and the occupation. Moderates, though, despised them, but overall the effect of the Red Feast was slightly mixed. Some members of the communists outright left for other resistance groups. Disgusted by the Red Feast, Aimuria cut off aid to communist forces but was later reopened thanks to Thomas Shelby, who urged that he will stand trial for the war crimes of the Red Feast, but urged the moderates to seek cooperation right now for Familia's sake. Familia has never been a peaceful state, and the massacre of civilians was certainly unjustified, but this goes to show just how violent the situation has become, and just how much violence begets violence. I wish I could close this little history lesson out with some warm words of encouragement. But the war still rages on, and there is still so much untold suffering across the world. I wish I had more time to continue, but Vivans has made sure to keep a ritualistic terror bombing of all forested areas in Familia to kill all potential hiding spots for communist forces due to the expansion of the underground railway. Every day is hell, but someday I hope it'll be nothing more than a distant memory. For Familia, for peace. My name is William Petrov. These are the tales of Familia.